At the age of 85, Neil Diamond is regarded as one of the greatest icons of American popular music, an artist who shaped an entire generation with his timeless melodies and songs that became collective memories for millions of people. With more than 130 million records sold worldwide, he ranks among the best-selling artists of all time. Songs like Sweet Caroline, Cracklin' Rosie, Song Sung Blue, Holly Holy, and especially America not only topped the charts but also became cultural symbols, appearing in stadiums, festivals, and historic moments of America. He was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1984, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2011, and received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award as recognition for his entire songwriting and performing career. Neil Diamond was also awarded the Kennedy Center Honors, affirming his status not only in music but in the entire modern American culture. His tours once drew millions of audiences around the world, turning him into one of the most influential stage performers in the history of pop and rock music. But behind those numbers and the spotlight is a journey that was never easy, where Neil Diamond had to fight against time itself, loneliness, and the limitations of his own body. He once admitted that there were periods in his career when singing became his whole life. He felt swallowed by the stage lights, and the bigger the fame, the farther the distance between him and the real world. The broken marriages, the tours that lasted for months, and the feeling of always having to stand at the peak created an invisible pressure, making him both beloved and lonely in his own success. When Parkinson's was diagnosed in 2018, Neil Diamond was not only facing a disease, but also facing the need to leave the stage, the place that had defined him for more than half a century. He accepted that silence, not with surrender, but with a quiet pain and rare resilience, continuing to live, continuing to compose within the new limits of his body, as a way to keep the last part of the voice that once belonged to the whole world. Before we continue into the journey behind the spotlight of Neil Diamond, please hit like and subscribe to the channel if you do not want to miss the untold stories about music legends. A small click from you is the way to remember a voice that once made the whole world beat together, but now only echoes in memory. From the brilliant spotlight of a music legend, Neil Diamond's story begins to step far back, returning to the old streets of Brooklyn where he was born in 1941. In a Jewish immigrant family, trying to find their place in a competitive and harsh America, it was not a poor childhood in a dramatized sense, but a childhood of more subtle deprivation, where affection was not expressed, where warmth was not always present, and where a boy like Neil had to learn to observe the world more than being listened to by that world. His family was not a cruel family, but carried the characteristic silence of immigrants who had to focus on survival more than emotions. His father, a strict working man, always emphasized stability and responsibility, while his mother carried gentleness, but reservedly, not the type of affection shown through words or frequent hugs. In that environment, Neil grew up as a child who did not make noise, did not stand out, did not demand much, and that very thing gradually made him become a faded part in his own family, as if his existence was not the center of any attention. The boy Neil was not the one who got attention at school, nor was he someone who easily fit in. He observed more than he spoke, listened more than he shared, and gradually learned that silence was the safest way to exist in a world that did not make much room for emotions. No one intentionally hurt him, but the lack of words of recognition, words of encouragement, or simply a proud look from his parents, created in him a silent void, long-lasting and hard to name. He did not know that this not being seen would become a very deep part of himself later, a form of wordless memory that never disappeared. It was in that void that music appeared like something strange but full of salvation. A guitar placed in his hands was not just a musical instrument, but like a door opening to where he could finally exist in the most complete way. When the first note sounded, Neil was no longer the boy who was overshadowed in the family. no longer the child standing on the edge of attention, but became someone who could create sound, who could make others listen, even if only for a brief moment. That was the first time in his life he felt something close to recognition, not from people, but from music itself. But along with that comfort, the seeds of loneliness also began to be sown. It was not loud or tragic loneliness, but a quiet, accumulating loneliness over the years. When a child learned to find his value not in the eyes of others, but in the melodies he created himself. Neil Diamond grew up with the feeling that the outside world did not fully open its arms to him, and that very thing made him more attached to his inner world. Each note, each early song was not only creation, but also a way for him to tell himself that he was existing, that he had a voice, that he was not completely forgotten. In those early years of life, there were no major events, no intense drama, but there was something more important, the formation of a soul that always longed to be heard. And it was from there that Neil Diamond's journey began, not with white, but with a prolonged silence, where a boy learned to turn his invisibility into music as the only way not to be forgotten by the world. From the early days growing up in silence and the feeling of fading in his own family, Neil Diamond entered adulthood with a vague belief that he had to become something more stable, safer, and perhaps enough to make his parents proud. That is why he once chose the path of medicine at New York University, a choice that did not come from passion, but from the invisible pressure of expectations and responsibility. But right from the first days stepping into the lecture hall, Neil felt that something was not right. The lectures on anatomy, the long hours in the cold laboratory, all were alien to the inner world where music was still silently ringing non-stop inside him. And then he dropped out. The decision was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a heavy sense of failure that Neil carried with him for a very long time afterward. In the eyes of his family and society, medicine was the path of stability, of clear success, while abandoning it to pursue music was only a vague, uncertain choice. Even though no one said it outright, Neil still felt that quiet disappointment, like a wordless pressure weighing on his shoulders. He did not become the person others expected, and that made him begin his journey with the feeling that he had already failed right from the starting line. With no clear map, no safe plan, Neil stepped into New York, a city that was both vast and indifferent, where millions of people were trying to find their place. He lived on small jobs, unstable days, and long nights with only music as his companion. In a tiny room, he began writing songs not to become famous, but to survive. Each melody was a way for him to keep his sanity in a city that never slept, where one person's dream was often built on another person's failure. But that journey was not easy at all. Neil Diamond was not immediately welcomed by the music industry. He went from one studio to another, from brief hopeful meetings to cold head shakes. There were times he was listened to for only a few minutes before being rejected, times when his songs were judged as not suitable, not commercial, or simply not different enough. Each time like that, he left with a feeling that a door had just closed behind him, quietly but decisively. In those years, Neil was not a name. He was not an artist, not a star, not even a prospect. He was just an anonymous songwriter among thousands of others trying just like him. And that very anonymity made him wonder many times whether he really belonged there or not. There were nights when, sitting alone in the small room, he listened to the songs he had just written. Not with pride, but with a silent question. Did what he was doing mean anything, or was it just another effort slowly drifting into oblivion? The feeling of not belonging here gradually became a part of him. It was not loud despair, but a quiet doubt that followed every step. But even in that uncertainty, Neil Diamond still continued to write. No one recognized him, but he still wrote. No one guaranteed success, but he still did not stop. Music became the only thing that did not reject him. even as the outside world kept doing so. And in that journey full of rejection, something important began to form. Neil Diamond no longer wrote music to be accepted, but wrote music because he could not write. The loneliness, the early failures, and the feeling of being left out of the main flow of the industry quietly created an artist who was not easily broken, even though no one knew his name yet. Even though no one called him a legend, right in those seemingly meaningless years, Neil Diamond had begun to form what would later make the whole world listen to him standing on stage, leaving behind the early years full of confusion and the feeling of not belonging anywhere. Neil Diamond stepped into a period that he later called the invisible years, where he existed in the music industry but was almost never seen as a real artist. The center of this period was the Brill Building in New York, a place regarded as the music factory of the era, where pop songs were written, edited, and sold at a dizzying speed. But in that space, Neil was not a star, but only one of many songwriters trying to find a fragile place for himself. He wrote songs for others, and those very songs sometimes became other people's successes. The melodies left his hands to reach other artists, were recorded, released, and played on the radio, while the name Neil Diamond did not appear under the stage lights or on the charts. He watched his music live, a life that did not belong to him, and that brought a feeling that was very hard to name. Not exactly failure, but not success either. It was the in-between state of someone who created something valuable, but was not recognized as its creator. In many cases, the songs that Neil wrote were even rejected right from the start. There were songs he believed would touch the listener's emotions, but they were turned down by producers because they were considered not suitable for the market. Those rejections were not loud, not cruel in a direct way, but they repeated enough times to create an invisible pressure weighing heavily on him. Each time a song was rejected, it was not just a product being discarded, but also a part of Neil himself being questioned. To survive in this industry, Neil Diamond was forced to accept a harsh reality. Not every talent was seen immediately, and not every effort was rewarded at the right time. He continued to write, continued to send out new songs, continued to hope that one of them would be accepted. But between the loops of creation and rejection, what tired him the most was not the failure, but the prolongation of not being recognized. The pressure of surviving in the profession began to seep into every small detail of his life. Writing songs was no longer just creation, but became a way to maintain financial existence. Each song could be the rent, the next meal, the chance to stay in New York for one more month. That is why music gradually carried two parallel meanings, both passion and survival. And the tension between those two things slowly wore down his inner self over time. In the small rooms, amid the noise of the city that never slept, Neil Diamond many times fell into a deep state of loneliness. It was not loneliness because there was no one around, but loneliness right in the middle of an industry full of creators. He saw other talents get signed, promoted, recognized, while he still stood on the edge of that light. The feeling of being left behind did not come as a shock, but like a slow, quiet flow that was unavoidable. It was in this period that Neil began to understand an important thing about the world he was trying to step into. Music was not just talent, but also persistence in the darkness, and he was living completely in that darkness. But instead of leaving, he chose to stay, not because he believed success would surely come, but because he could not imagine himself doing anything else besides writing music. And so, between the cramped Brill Building, between the songs that were rejected and the songs that lived without his name, Neil Diamond continued to exist as an invisible person in the very industry that he would later conquer. But in that invisibility, something important was quietly forming. A storytelling voice, a style, and a musical identity that no one had recognized yet, but would soon change everything. After the long years of living in invisibility and continuous rejection at the Brill Building, Neil Diamond finally touched a moment that he had once dreamed of but never dared to believe would really happen. That was when Solitary Man was born. a song that was not just a music product, but like a deep cut from his own inner self, where loneliness was no longer a passing feeling but became the essence of the person. That song did not arrive like a big explosion right away, did not turn him into a star overnight, but it began to spread like a slow aftershock, enough for the music industry to pay real attention to the name Neil Diamond for the first time. Solitary Man carried a rare authenticity, and that very thing made it different. For the first time, what Neil wrote was not just seen as a commercial product or an experiment from an anonymous songwriter, but was recognized as the voice of an individual with emotional depth. But even in that seemingly turning point moment, Neil Diamond was still not truly freed from himself. Success came to him, but it came slowly, and more importantly, it did not come completely. After Solitary Man, the following songs began to receive more attention. Some songs started appearing on the radio. Others were successfully performed by different artists, and the name Neil Diamond gradually escaped from the absolute darkness. But that fame did not come in the explosive way he had once imagined. It was like a door cracked open, enough for light to slip in, but not enough for him to step fully outside. And in that half-light, half-dark space, Neil began to live in a very special state. He was known, but he never truly felt safe. Each step forward in his career came with a new sense of unease. When the songs began to be accepted, Neil did not feel victorious, but felt anxious that it would soon disappear. After many years of rejection, he had learned how to live in failure, but he had never learned how to live in success. Therefore, even when his name began to appear more often, he still did not believe that he would stay in this industry for long. In his mind, success was always temporary, like something that could be taken away at any moment. That is why, even though Solitary Man had opened the first door, Neil Diamond still carried within himself a very deep form of emotional defense. He continued to write music, continued to perform, continued to step onto smaller stages, then larger ones. But inside him there always existed an indelible doubt. Every compliment, every small success was not enough to fill the inner crack that had formed from the previous invisible years. Fame, in the way Neil Diamond experienced it, was not a healing medicine. It was like a layer of light covering wounds that had never truly been treated. He stood on stage, saw the audience beginning to sing along with him, felt the recognition he had once longed for. But at the same time, he also realized that the empty feeling inside did not disappear. It only changed shape. Instead of complete anonymity, it now became loneliness in the middle of the crowd, where he was seen by thousands of people, but still did not truly feel understood. In this period, Neil Diamond began to realize a quiet but painful truth. Being recognized did not mean being healed. The cracks inside him did not disappear when the applause sounded, but on the contrary, sometimes became even clearer when the stage lights went out. He left the stage and returned to the hotel room, where the silence returned like an uninvited old friend. Solitary Man may have marked the beginning of recognition, but it did not change the core in Neil Diamond, a man who had grown used to doubting his own worth. And that very doubt would continue to follow him, even when the world began to call his name with bigger titles, even when the stages became wider and wider, and even when his voice began to touch millions of people. After the initial turning point that Solitary Man brought, Neil Diamond gradually stepped into the period when the whole world began to truly know his name. But at the same time, it was also the period when the gap between the person inside and the image on stage began to widen, to the point where it could no longer be narrowed. And no song expressed that paradox more clearly than Sweet Caroline, a song that seemed simple and cheerful, but became a global symbol, tied to collective moments where tens of thousands of people sang together as one. Sweet Caroline was not just a hit song. It became a cultural phenomenon. From baseball stadiums in America to festivals, crowds of thousands sang "Ba Ba Ba" in unison, creating an energy that was almost impossible to explain with reason. Neil Diamond stood at the center of all those moments, and in the eyes of the world, he was the one who created joy, the one who connected the emotions of millions of strangers into one shared voice. But behind that explosion, in the very moment he stood on stage, the feeling inside him was not always joy. Something very quiet but profound began to happen in Neil Diamond when his career reached its peak, when the audience sang along with him, when the entire stadium seemed to become one, when his voice no longer belonged to him alone, but became everyone's. That was exactly when he began to feel he was drifting away from himself. The connection that the world saw actually came with an inner separation that no one else noticed. He stood there, in front of tens of thousands of people singing in harmony. But in that moment, he was no longer sure where he really was in his own story. The bigger the success of Sweet Caroline was, the deeper the gap in his inner self became. Each time the song played, it was not only a moment of glory, but also a reminder that Neil Diamond had become a symbol that went beyond his true self. He was no longer simply a songwriter or a singer, but an image shaped by the public, by collective memory, by the emotions that others assigned to him. And in that process, his personal identity gradually dissolved into the very success he had once longed for. On stage, he smiled. He led the crowd. He felt the energy spreading throughout the space. But when the lights went out, when the cheers stopped, when he stepped down from the stage and returned to the quiet behind the scenes, the empty feeling came back, even clearer than before. It was no longer the loneliness of the anonymous years, but a different kind of loneliness. The loneliness of a person who had been known by the whole world but was no longer sure he belonged to that very moment anymore. There were nights when Neil Diamond sat alone after the show, when the sound of tens of thousands of voices still echoed somewhere in his memory. He wondered whether the man on stage and the man sitting in the hotel room were still the same. The difference between those two people became clearer and clearer. One was the symbol, the voice of the crowd, Sweet Caroline ringing out in collective happy moments. The other was just a quiet individual, carrying fatigue and an unnameable sense of distance. It was in this period that Neil began to feel more clearly than ever something he had never faced before, the feeling of no longer being completely himself on stage. Not because he was fake or had lost his talent, but because his image had become too big compared to the real person. The public saw a symbol, while he felt he was only a very small part inside that symbol. And that discrepancy, even though no one saw it, became a quiet crack in his entire experience of success. Sweet Caroline continued to ring out through many generations, continued to be sung by people who had never met Neil Diamond but felt as if they knew him. But for Neil himself, each time he heard that song again, it was not only a memory of success, but also a reminder of a hard-to-say truth, that there are moments in life when you reach the highest peak. You can also lose the feeling of belonging to that very place. And in the brightest light of his career, Neil Diamond began to step into a very personal dark zone, where success was no longer liberation, but became a mask that could not be taken off. After the light of Sweet Caroline spread across America and beyond its borders, Neil Diamond stepped into a period that, from the outside, looked like the complete peak of fame, but from the inside was a long chain of voids that could not be filled. His performance schedule became so dense that there was almost no boundary between day and night, between stage and real life. Continuous flights, cities following one after another, stadiums always waiting for him like a symbol that was not allowed to stop. And in that rhythm of life, Neil Diamond gradually lost what seemed the simplest thing, the feeling of being at home. He no longer lived in one fixed place, but lived in similar hotel rooms in different cities, where everything was clean and convenient, but carried no memories belonging to him. Each time a show ended, when the applause was still ringing in his ears, he returned to the silence of the backstage, then continued to move again. It was in that repetition that a very slow but very deep feeling began to form, the feeling of never truly belonging anywhere. The two marriages in his life, which had once been emotional anchors, also began to bear the unavoidable pressure from this rhythm of life. There was no single event that broke everything, but rather a gradual erosion over time. Shorter phone calls, longer absences, family moments replaced by commitments that could not be postponed. Neil Diamond was not someone who intentionally stayed away from his family, but he also could not stay long enough to become a complete part of their lives, and that created a quiet but lasting crack in both marriages. His children grew up in the absence of their father, not in the absolute sense, but in the way a father always appeared late, left early, and was swept into a world that they could only see from afar. Neil Diamond still loved his family, but that love was often not enough to resist the weight of a career at its peak. He became a father in the short intervals between tours, an image both close and distant, both present and absent. In those years, fame brought him everything an artist could dream of: bigger stages, larger audiences, deeper influence. But at the same time, it also took away from him something that no award could replace: the stability of his personal life. Neil Diamond began to realize that he was living in a paradox that could not be solved. The more he was loved by many people, the less he had truly deep connections in his private life. Fame, in his case, was no longer pure light, but became a special form of isolation. A person could stand in the middle of tens of thousands of audience members and feel their love, but when stepping off the stage, return to a silent room with no one truly waiting. That contrast was not loud, not dramatized, but it followed him like a long shadow, stretching through the years. There were moments when Neil Diamond sat alone after the show, when everything had ended, and he wondered what he was really living for. Not because he was unhappy, but because he began to feel clearly that his life had been divided into two parts that could not be merged, one part belonging to the stage, and one part belonging to the silence that he almost no longer had time to touch. And in that gap, he gradually understood the real price of being loved by millions of people. Not losing success, but losing the ability to live fully in the smallest things of human life. Amid the increasingly brilliant spotlight of his career, Neil Diamond stepped into his personal life with an unavoidable paradox. The more the whole world loved him, the harder it was for him to keep his closest relationships intact. The two marriages in his life did not break apart because of loud tragedies or scandals exposed to the public, but because of something quieter, yet also more cruel: the distance created by the non-stop rhythm of fame itself. Neil's first marriage took place when he was still very young, in the period when his career was still finding its way to form. It was the time when he had just begun to have the first signs of recognition, while also facing the pressure of proving himself in a harsh industry. Love at that stage carried sincerity and hope, but it was also placed in a situation not yet solid enough to withstand the big waves from a career that was gradually exploding. As Neil began to travel more, as the performances began to last longer, as music began to take over all his time and mind, that relationship gradually fell into a state that could not be maintained. There was no single breaking moment, only a gradually increasing distance with each trip, each day of absence, until both were forced to accept that young love could not walk the path Neil was stepping into. The second marriage lasted longer, deeper, and seemed more stable from the outside, but that very length made the distances become clear in a slower and more painful way. There were no big arguments, no sudden collapse, only a quiet flow of absence. Neil Diamond was still a husband, still a father, but most of the time he was not there. He was present in name, in short phone calls, in the times he returned between tours, but could not be fully present in the everyday moments that truly created the bond of a family. The most painful thing in this story was not the breakup itself, but the fact that it happened without needing a clear tragedy. There was no public betrayal, no intense conflict, no single ending moment that could be pointed to and said, "Here, everything broke." Instead, It was a slow process of cracking, where love still existed, but presence gradually disappeared, and that very absence created a form of emptiness that was very hard to name, a feeling that everything once had meaning, but could not be kept in the way it once was. Neil Diamond did not lose the ability to love, but he gradually lost the ability to stay long enough for that love to become complete. He loved his family in the way of an artist who was always pulled by duty and passion, but that very thing made love become something that was always interrupted. Deep down, he understood that no one was completely at fault, but also no one was truly innocent in the long voids that stretched through the years. When looking back, those years carried a form of regret that was not loud, not explosive, but persistent and lasting. Neil Diamond did not talk much about it, did not turn it into a public story, but it existed like an emotional underlayer that followed him for decades afterward. It was the realization that some things in life do not disappear in one moment, but fade away gradually when we are not present long enough to keep them. And it was in that silence that a profound truth about Neil Diamond's life gradually emerged. Success does not always destroy love, but it can make love become so distant that it no longer recognizes itself. After the quiet breakdowns in his emotional life, Neil Diamond stepped into a period that the outside world thought was the absolute peak of a legend, but inside was a form of pressure that was hard to name, growing heavier and lasting through the years. With more than 130 million albums sold worldwide, a series of songs becoming classics, and sold-out tours across continents, Neil Diamond was no longer simply an artist. He became a symbol, but that very transformation created an invisible gap between the real person and the image the world saw. When an artist becomes a symbol, they are no longer seen as a person changing over time, but as a model that must be kept unchanged. Neil Diamond gradually realized that the public not only loved his music, but also loved the image he represented. Warmth, connection, collective empathy, and along with that love came an invisible expectation that he must always be like that, always bring that feeling, always maintain that image, no matter what he was going through in his personal life. That pressure did not come loudly, but came very slowly, very deeply, and very hard to notice. Each time he stepped on stage, Neil was not simply performing. He was fulfilling a role that millions of people had become familiar with. The audience came to find familiar emotions, to sing along to Sweet Caroline, to relive the collective memories that his music had created. But behind those seemingly perfect moments, Neil began to feel something that very few people outside noticed. He was gradually being framed within his own image. Fame, instead of bringing joy, as many people thought, began to become a form of endless responsibility. Each new album was not only an artistic work, but also a commitment that he still held the Neil Diamond the world expected. Each performance was not only a night of music, but a confirmation that the symbol remained intact. And in that process, the boundary between the person and the symbol became increasingly blurred, until even Neil was no longer sure who he was beyond the image the public was seeing. There were very small but decisive moments when Neil Diamond stood on stage and realized that his presence at that time no longer fully belonged to him. He was not only singing for the audience, but also singing for their memories, for their expectations, for a version of himself that had been preserved in the minds of millions of people through many decades. And in that harmony, he again felt a separation from himself that became increasingly clear. The more famous he became, the more Neil Diamond had to face a difficult paradox. He was loved by millions of people, but had less and less space for his own privacy. Every action, every product, every appearance carried the weight of a legacy that had already been shaped. That made him gradually withdraw into his personal life, not because he wanted to retreat, but because there was no longer much room to exist as an ordinary person. His inner self began to close in a very slow way. It was not a collapse or sudden change, but a gradual shrinking of the most vulnerable parts in him. Private emotions became harder to share, Deep thoughts were kept more, and music, instead of being a place of complete release, sometimes became the only place where he could put emotions that could not be spoken. In the brilliant stage lights, Neil Diamond was still a symbol of connection, a person who could make tens of thousands of people sing together, feel together. But behind that light was a person who was increasingly understanding the price of becoming a symbol. The more he was seen by many people, the harder it was to be seen fully as a real human being. And it was in that discrepancy that the burden of a global legend began to become an inseparable part of his life. When Neil Diamond passed the peak of fame, what the world saw was still an irreplaceable legend. A man who could make an entire stadium sing together, who could turn simple melodies into collective memories for millions of people. But inside that seemingly eternal stability, small cracks began to appear. Not loud, not clear, but enough to change the way he felt about his own career. It was not a collapse, but a prolonged fatigue, accumulated through decades of standing on stage, constant traveling, and living in a rhythm that the human body was never truly designed to maintain forever. The fatigue was initially very subtle. It did not appear as a clear sign, but crept into every performance, every trip, every time standing in front of the audience. Neil Diamond still worked, still performed with the professionalism and resilience of a veteran artist. But something in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the way he stepped onto the stage, began to carry the signs of time. It was not a sudden weakening, but a gradual change of a body that had lived too long in the lights and the noise. His voice, which had once been a symbol of warmth and connection, also began to change over the years. It did not disappear completely, did not vanish in a single moment, but it no longer held the same shape as before. Each note carried traces of time, of long tours, of sleepless nights, and of the very life he had lived fully in music. For the audience, that change was sometimes just a small detail, but for Neil Diamond, it was a profound awareness that nothing in artistic life stands still forever. After each performance, when the stage lights went out and the applause gradually faded, Neil would step into a completely different space. A silence so deep and long that it was almost in complete contrast to what had just happened before. In that moment, he was no longer the person standing in front of tens of thousands of audience members, but returned to being a solitary human being backstage, where there was no more music, no more lights, no more resonance. It was those moments, more than the stage itself, that were where he felt the loneliness of the profession he had chosen most clearly. There was a very important change that occurred in this period. Neil Diamond began to gradually lose the feeling of belonging to the lights. Before, the stage was where he existed most completely, where he felt seen, connected, and living true to his artist nature. But over time, those lights began to carry a different meaning. They were no longer liberation, but became a space so familiar that it no longer brought any new feeling. He still stood there, still sang, still was loved, but the feeling of belonging gradually faded. Success, which had once been the goal, once the motivation, once the desire, now began to become a habit. Neil Diamond no longer experienced it as an explosive emotion, but as a pre-shaped chain of repetition. The stage, the audience, the applause, the lights, everything was still there, but no longer created the same level of vibration as before. And in that shift, he began to realize something very quiet. When success becomes something taken for granted, it also gradually loses its ability to bring the vivid feeling it once had. But the most painful thing was not the change in his career, but the change in the way he felt about himself within that career. Neil Diamond was still Neil Diamond in the eyes of the world, but in his own inner self, that image began to become more distant, as if he was looking back at himself from an increasingly large distance. There was no clear breakdown, no tragic turning point, only a chain of small realizations accumulating over time, making him gradually understand that even the brightest light could become so familiar that it no longer overwhelmed anyone. And in the silence after the stage, Neil Diamond began to step into a new phase of his life, where the question was no longer how much he had achieved, but what was left of him when all the applause stopped. When Neil Diamond stepped deeper into the final years of his performing career, the change did not come suddenly or loudly, but like a slow flow of time, quiet but irreversible. His voice, which had once been the center of every stage, every memory, every moment connecting millions of people, began to carry clear traces of age. It did not disappear, but it no longer held the original shape that made the whole world recognize it from the very first notes. Neil Diamond was the one who felt that change before the audience. Each time standing in front of the microphone, each time raising his voice, he realized that his body no longer responded the way it used to. The high notes became harder to hold. His breath was no longer as long as in the peak years, and the stability in his voice, which had once been instinct, now required more effort. It was not a collapse, but the natural decline of an artist who had lived too long in the lights. But that very naturalness carried a very deep, very hard-to-name sadness. The hardest thing for Neil was not the change in his voice, but the realization that it was inevitable. Throughout most of his life, he had grown used to controlling everything within his ability, the stage, the music, the emotions of the audience. But time was not under that control. It came quietly, without permission, without negotiation, and took away, piece by piece, what had once been considered eternal. And when Neil Diamond began to clearly feel the change in his own voice, he also faced a truth that was not easy to accept. The thing that defined him in the eyes of the world was gradually moving away from him. That feeling was not loud, not explosive, but it carried a lasting weight. For an artist, the voice is not just a performance tool, but identity, selfhood, the way to exist in the world. Therefore, when Neil realized that his voice was no longer as before, he was not only facing a career change, but also facing a deeper form of loss, the feeling of losing a part of himself. No one said it directly to him. There was no clear declaration moment, but he understood that there were things that did not need to be spoken to become true. In the final performances, Neil Diamond still stood on stage with professionalism and gratitude for the audience, but inside him, there was an increasingly clear split between the outer image and the inner feeling. The audience still sang along, still stood up, still gave him long rounds of applause, but within him the feeling of completeness gradually gave way to a quiet contemplation. He no longer experienced music as a natural flow of emotion, but as a memory being reenacted in the present. It was in this period that music began to transform its role in Neil Diamond's life. It was no longer the absolute present, no longer where he lived fully in every moment, but gradually became an archive of memories, a place he could return to but could not stay in forever. Each song, each track that once carried intense life on stage, now carried another layer of meaning. It was not only a performance, but a recollection of a time when everything was more intact, stronger, and closer to his true nature. The sadness in this period did not come from a specific event, but from a prolonged process of awareness. Neil Diamond did not complain, did not publicly express regret, did not turn it into a tragic story. Instead, he kept it in silence, just as he had kept many other emotions throughout his life. But that very silence made the sadness deeper, because it had no ending point, no solution, no moment of release. There were nights after the show, when everything had ended, and the stage became empty. Neil Diamond felt very clearly that he was standing at the boundary between two versions of himself. One who once had a voice that could shake the whole world, and one who was learning to accept that that voice was no longer the same. And in the silence between those two versions, he understood that he was not only witnessing the change of his career, but also witnessing the shift of the very artistic identity he had built throughout his life. When Neil Diamond stepped into 2018, he had lived long enough in the spotlight to understand that some changes in life do not come as a single shock, but like a slow whisper from the body, until they can no longer be ignored. The Parkinson's diagnosis did not arrive as a loud tragedy, not as a moment of collapse in front of the public, but as a quiet confirmation of the signs he had already felt before: the slowing in movement, the change in body control, and the increasingly clear feeling that the stage no longer responded to him the way it used to. What made that moment heavy was not despair, but clarity. Neil Diamond did not react with drama or denial. He accepted it with the calm of a person who had gone through enough cycles of fame, loss, and change to understand that there are things that cannot be negotiated with time. But that very calm hid a deeper truth. This was not just a medical diagnosis, but an uncrossable boundary between his past and future on stage. From that point on, everything began to change in a very slow but very clear way. Performances were no longer something he could carry out with the same freedom as before. The body, which had once been the perfect tool to connect with tens of thousands of audience members, now became no longer completely reliable. Every step, every time standing in front of the microphone, every familiar gesture on stage carried a new level of calculation, a caution that had not existed before. And in that process, Neil Diamond began to realize that performing was no longer a natural instinct, but was becoming a limited effort. There was no single moment marking the end, no sudden announcement that he would leave the stage forever. Instead, it was a very slow, very gentle, but also very painful process of withdrawal. Neil Diamond continued touring for a while longer, continued standing on stage with deep gratitude for the audience, but inside he had begun to understand that this was no longer a path that could last forever. Each night of performance became a small unspoken goodbye, but one that was felt very clearly in every moment. The decision to leave the tour did not come as giving up, but as acceptance. Neil Diamond understood that holding on to his image on stage at all costs was no longer appropriate, not only for his body, but also for the very meaning of the music he had pursued all his life. And so, he chose to leave quietly, without noise, without show, without turning it into a symbolic farewell event. It was a deeply personal decision, a goodbye that did not need an audience but was full of meaning for him alone. The moment Neil Diamond left the stage lights for the last time was not marked by a big explosion or a performance ending in tears. It happened in stillness, the way many of the most important things in his life had once happened. There was no clear ending, only a gradual absence of new appearances. The stage, which had once been where he belonged most completely, now became a memory that could be looked back on but no longer stepped into. The most painful thing in this period was not that he stopped performing, but that he understood a very important part of himself had left the place that once defined him. Neil Diamond did not lose his fame, did not lose his legacy, but he lost a form of presence that he had lived with for decades, and in that absence, he began a new journey. No longer the person standing on stage, but the person living with the memory of that stage. Parkinson's did not take everything in one moment. It took away piece by piece, each ability, each movement, each freedom he had once taken for granted. But it was precisely in that gradual loss that Neil Diamond also showed a quiet form of dignity. He did not fight time with denial, but accepted it with respectful silence. And perhaps that is why the moment he left the stage was not a tragedy, but a gentle yet permanent farewell to the lights he had once belonged to. After leaving the stage lights and accepting the irreversible change of his body, Neil Diamond stepped into a new phase of his life, no longer measured by tours, packed stadiums, or long rounds of applause, but defined by the gradual shrinking of living space and life rhythm. His life, which had once expanded across the world, now gradually shrank into the boundaries of a quiet home, where time flowed more slowly, and the sound of the past became clearer than anything in the present. With no more tours, no more intercontinental flights, no more nights standing on stage facing tens of thousands of people, Neil Diamond lived in a world where silence became the default state. But it was not a completely empty silence, but a silence thick with memories. In every corner of the house, in every quiet moment, the music of an entire career still existed, not as actual sound, but as echoes that never completely disappeared. His daily life was no longer dominated by a dense schedule or performance pressure. Instead, it was slower, simpler rhythms, almost contemplative. This change did not come as a shock, but as a natural shift of time, where a person who once lived in brilliant light now learned to live in softer, smaller, but also deeper light. However, that very change carried an unfilled void, the void of the stage. With no more audience, no more cheers, no more feeling of thousands of people singing together in one voice, Neil Diamond began to feel clearly the absence of what had once defined him throughout his life. But what was special was that the stage did not disappear from him. It only moved from the outside world into the inside world. He was still there, but no longer in the physical sense. In his mind, the images of the lights, the performances, the moments when tens of thousands of people sang along to Sweet Caroline continued to exist like films that never stopped playing. Songwriting, which had once been an act tied to creation and performance, now became a form of recollection. Neil Diamond no longer wrote to conquer the charts or to prepare for a new tour. He wrote as a way to hold on to the parts of memory that were gradually drifting away, as a way to converse with his own past. Each melody no longer carried the pressure of success, but carried the weight of time. They were quiet conversations between the present person and the person who had once stood on stage many years before. In the stillness of his current life, Neil Diamond sometimes had the feeling that a part of himself had not yet left the stage, not in a delusional sense, but in a deeper emotional sense. As if the person who once stood under the lights still existed somewhere inside him, continuing to sing, continuing to connect, continuing to live in a space that his current body could no longer step into. And that very parallelism created a very special form of existence, a person living both in the present and in the memory of himself. The shrinking of life did not mean the end, but it completely changed the way Neil Diamond perceived the world around him. Things that had once been small in the past, a melody segment, a memory of a performance, a moment when the audience sang together, now became clearer and more profound than ever. When no longer swept away by the pace of his career, he began to look back at his entire journey, not as a continuous chain of successes, but as a flow of memories, where each phase left an indelible mark. In that quiet space, Neil Diamond was no longer the symbol of millions as before, but he did not disappear either. He existed in a different way, slower, quieter, but deeper, and it was precisely in the shrinking of his life that he began to understand that there are things that do not need to be grand to become eternal. His music, his memories, and his image on stage continued to live not in the noise of the present, but in the prolonged silence of time. Even though Neil Diamond had left the stage lights, the world he had once helped shape did not stop. In baseball stadiums across America, at outdoor festivals, in bars, among crowds of strangers, Sweet Caroline still rang out like an indispensable ritual. As soon as the first note sounded, the entire space seemed to change instantly. Thousands of people sang along in unison, creating a collective moment that few songs in history could recreate. But the biggest change in all those moments was, Neil Diamond was no longer there. He no longer stood on stage, no longer held the microphone, no longer led the crowd through each line of the song. But the paradox of legacy is that his absence did not diminish the life of the music, but on the contrary, made it become an independent part of culture. Sweet Caroline no longer belonged to Neil Diamond alone in the performing sense, but belonged to the collective memory of millions of people. And it was in that transfer that a quiet but profound truth took shape. The world continued to sing, even when the person who created the song could no longer sing with them. In some place within the stillness of his private life, Neil Diamond may no longer stand directly among those crowds, but he knows that they still exist. He may hear them again through the radio, through video clips, or simply in his own memory. And each time like that, he faces a feeling that is both warm and distant. Warm because his music is still alive, still loved, still connecting people with one another. But distant because he is no longer a direct part of that moment anymore. This contrast becomes clearer as time passes. The world continues to move, continues to sing, continues to recreate Neil Diamond's songs as an indispensable part of popular culture. But he stops at a different point, a point where music is no longer the present, but becomes memory. Not the public's memory of him, but his own memory of himself. A person who once stood among tens of thousands of people now only stands among his own recollections. There is something very quiet but painful in this parallelism. The world does not stop because of the absence of one artist. Even if he is a legend, the songs continue to be sung, the stadiums continue to echo with the familiar unison, and new generations still discover Neil Diamond's music as if it has always existed, ready in the culture. But meanwhile, the man who created all of that can no longer step onto the stage to witness it directly anymore. Legacy, in a very unique way, has replaced presence. Neil Diamond no longer needs to stand on stage for his music to live. It lives on its own, spreads on its own, continues its journey in the modern world on its own. But that replacement is not a complete replacement. It carries within it a void that only the creator can fully feel. It is the feeling of seeing a part of oneself existing independently out there, while oneself is no longer the one directly controlling it anymore. In the rare moments when Neil Diamond looks back at his journey, perhaps he understands that this is one of the greatest paradoxes of art. The more successful, the less the artist belongs to the present moment of his own work. His music has gone beyond him, becoming part of the world, of collective memory, of emotions that do not need physical presence to exist. But the price of that is the separation between the person and the legacy. The world still sings Sweet Caroline as if nothing has changed. But Neil Diamond knows that everything has changed, not because the music is different, but because his position in that music has shifted from participant to the one being remembered. And in that transition, he steps into a very different form of existence, no longer the center of the moment, but still the source of it, a presence that does not need to appear but also cannot disappear. At the age of 85, when looking back at Neil Diamond's entire journey, what emerges is not a loud story of scandal or collapse, but a long epic spanning more than half a century, where light and shadow do not separate from each other, but always go hand in every stage of his life. It is the story of an artist who not only lived in fame, but lived with it, was shaped by it, and finally was kept by it in the memory of millions of people. Neil Diamond is not the type of legend built from loud tragedies or shocks that shake the public. His life carries a different kind of tragedy, quieter, longer, and harder to recognize. The losses in his life did not come as explosive events, but as quiet flows. The distance in marriage, the voids in the role of father, the fatigue of the body, the unavoidable change of his voice, and finally the withdrawal from the stage that he once saw as his home. There was no major scandal that defined Neil Diamond, but that very absence created a form of silent loss. It was the life of an artist who always stood between light and his own absence. He was present in every melody, every stage, every moment when the audience sang along, but was often absent in the private parts of life that no light could reach. And that prolonged separation from time itself created a person who was both powerfully present in popular culture and quietly disappearing in personal life. When looking back at Neil Diamond's career, what makes people remember him not only as a singer, but as a part of America's memory? His songs are no longer simply music, but have become collective emotional milestones. Sweet Caroline is not just a song, but a ritual. America is not just a song, but a narrative of an entire generation. And in each of those melodies, Neil Diamond is no longer a single individual, but becomes part of a larger story that millions of people share together. But behind that immortality in music is a person who has gone through a life full of inner movement. He has lived long enough to witness his own change. From a lonely boy in Brooklyn to an anonymous songwriter in the Brill Building to a global star, and finally to a man leaving the stage in silence. Each phase carried its own form of loss, but also its own form of meaning, creating a journey that cannot be simplified into pure success or failure. At the age of 85, Neil Diamond no longer stands under the stage lights, no longer raises his voice in front of tens of thousands of people, no longer travels between long tours. But that does not mean he has disappeared. On the contrary, he is present in a different way, deeper, quieter, and more enduring. He is present in the memories of those who once sang along with him, in the moments when his music becomes the background for people's joy, sadness, love, and connection. There is a very light but very deep truth in Neil Diamond's story. Not every legend leaves in a loud way. There are people who do not disappear, but gradually become part of collective memory, with a boundary between the person and the music, between the artist and the work, almost dissolves. Neil Diamond belongs to that type of legend, a person who does not need to be mentioned continuously to be remembered, because his music does that for him. When looking back at that entire journey, people do not only see a successful artist, but also see a person who has lived fully in the tension between light and loneliness, between recognition and distance, between presence and absence. And perhaps that very tension has created the depth for his music. Music that is not only to be heard, but to be felt, to be remembered, and to be lived with. Neil Diamond did not disappear. He only left the form that the world was once familiar with, and in that departure, he became something bigger than himself, a part of collective memory, a voice that no longer needs to be raised to still be heard. He did not disappear. He slowly became the sound of memory itself. Looking back at Neil Diamond's entire journey, one can not only see a music legend with more than 130 million albums sold, or songs like Sweet Caroline that have become part of America's collective memory, but also see a person who has lived his whole life in the tug-of-war between stage lights and very deep silences in his private life. From the Brooklyn boy who grew up in an immigrant family that rarely expressed emotions, to the anonymous songwriter in the Brill Building who faced continuous rejection, then stepped into the light with Solitary Man, and later reached global peak with Sweet Caroline, Neil Diamond always walked with a paradox. The more millions of people sang along with him, the more he felt distant from himself. His story has no major scandal or loud tragedy, but is steeped in a form of silent loss. The gradual distancing in marriage, the years of absence in the role of father, and the feeling of never truly belonging to any fixed place because of the dense tour schedule and the pressure of fame. When Parkinson's was diagnosed and his voice gradually declined, his disappearance did not happen suddenly, but occurred slowly, just like the way time takes away piece by piece from an artist who once defined an entire generation. But it is precisely in that quietness that Neil Diamond left a legacy deeper than fame. His music became the collective memory of America, where thousands of people still sing Sweet Caroline, even though he is no longer on stage. The lesson from his life does not lie in the greatness of success, but in the price of being loved by the whole world. Success can pull a person to the peak, but it can also make them gradually drift away from the simplest things, like presence, connection, and inner peace. And in Neil Diamond's case, the greatest honor is not the awards or sales figures, but the fact that he has become an inseparable part of an entire nation's emotional memory. a proof that sometimes true legacy is not presence, but the way a person continues to live in the hearts of others, even when they have left the lights. If the story of Neil Diamond has touched your heart, please hit subscribe so we can continue to explore the journeys behind the spotlight of music legends together. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you in the next video, where memories and legacies continue to be told with all respect and emotion.